The last entry in Dr. Silas Crampton's leather-bound journal, dated November 15, 1887, contained only 7 words. Subject 247 screamed for 6 straight hours. When Kentucky state officials finally breached the locked doors of the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum 3 weeks later, they discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 214 men had vanished without a trace from the surrounding counties over 18 months, all officially declared insane by the same respected alienist. The mass grave behind the asylum contained twice that number. For nearly a century and 40 years, the Commonwealth of Kentucky has kept these records sealed, buried deeper than the victims themselves. Before we continue with the story of Dr. Silas Crampton and the nightmare that unfolded in Frankfurt, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. Because what happened in Kentucky could have happened anywhere in America. But the true horror of the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum began not with screams in the night, but with the quiet desperation of families who simply wanted their missing loved ones back. Frankfurt, in 1886, stood as Kentucky's proud capital, a city of nearly 8,000 souls perched along the Kentucky River's winding banks. The limestone buildings of the state government rose like monuments to progress, while steamboats churned the muddy waters carrying tobacco and bourbon to markets north. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity, Kentucky wrestled with the lingering wounds of the Civil War and the growing pains of Reconstruction. The Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum had opened its doors in 1874, a grand 3-story brick edifice designed in the popular Kirkbride plan, long wings radiating from a central administration building like the spokes of a wheel. Its towering cupola and manicured grounds suggested enlightened care for the mentally afflicted, a far cry from the chains and cages of earlier times. Dr. Silas Crampton had assumed leadership of the institution in 1884, bringing with him credentials from the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane and glowing recommendations from colleagues in Philadelphia. Crampton cut an imposing figure at 43 years of age, tall and lean, with prematurely silver hair swept back from a high forehead and piercing grey eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the world around him. His manner was precise, almost mechanical, as he conducted his daily rounds through the asylum's corridors. Staff members noted his habit of taking copious notes in a leather journal he carried constantly, scribbling observations in a cramped, nearly illegible hand. The doctor had arrived in Kentucky with ambitious plans. Mental illness, he proclaimed to the State Board of Commissioners, was not an incurable affliction, but a puzzle to be solved through rigorous scientific method. His published papers in medical journals spoke of revolutionary treatments that could restore even the most disturbed minds to perfect sanity. Governor James Proctor Knott, facing mounting pressure to modernize Kentucky's institutions, had given Crampton unprecedented authority over the asylum's operations and budget. Hannah Rutledge served as the asylum's head nurse, a stern-faced woman of 38, whose starched white uniform and rigid posture commanded instant respect from the staff. She had worked in similar institutions across the South since the war's end, carrying letters of recommendation that praised her efficiency and dedication. Her pale blue eyes held a coldness that made even hardened attendants uncomfortable, and patients quickly learned to fear the sound of her footsteps in the corridors. The asylum's patient population in early 1886 numbered just over 100 souls, men and women committed by families unable to care for them, vagrants picked up by local authorities, and Civil War veterans whose minds had shattered under the weight of battlefield horrors. Most came from Kentucky's rural counties, places where medical knowledge remained scarce and superstition still held sway over rational thought. But Crampton's vision extended far beyond treating the genuinely afflicted. He had begun corresponding with pharmaceutical companies in Boston and New York, promising to test new compounds that could revolutionize the treatment of mental illness. The potential profits were enormous. Whoever developed effective treatments for insanity could corner a market worth millions of dollars. All Crampton needed were sufficient test subjects, and Kentucky's sprawling rural counties provided an endless supply of forgotten men whose disappearances would barely be noticed. The first signs of something amiss came in the spring of 1886, when families in Breathitt County began reporting that their menfolk were vanishing during trips to Frankfort. Samuel Hutchins, a 42-year-old blacksmith, had traveled to the capital to sell horseshoes to the state government. His wife, Mary, received word a week later that Samuel had been committed to the asylum after displaying signs of violent mania in a downtown tavern. When she made the difficult journey to visit him, asylum staff informed her that Samuel had died of apoplexy during the night. Similar stories emerged from counties across eastern Kentucky. Hardy Pemberton, a Cumberland County farmer, disappeared while delivering a load of corn to Frankfort's grain merchants. His family learned of his commitment to the asylum only when they inquired with local authorities about his whereabouts. Like Samuel Hutchins, Hardy was reported dead within days of his arrival, supposedly succumbing to the advanced stages of dementia that had somehow escaped his family's notice for 43 years of his life. By autumn of 1886, a pattern had emerged that should have raised alarms throughout the Commonwealth. Men were disappearing from Kentucky's poorest counties at an alarming rate, all officially declared insane by Dr. Crampton or his associates, and all dying within days or weeks of their commitment. Yet the political machinery that might have investigated these disappearances had been carefully oiled with generous donations to Governor Nott's political fund. Contributions that arrived regularly from an account controlled by the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum. The night of October 13, 1886, marked the beginning of what asylum records would later euphemistically term the Accelerated Treatment Protocol. A cold autumn rain drummed against the asylum's windows as Dr. Crampton prepared for the arrival of 23 new patients, all committed that day by magistrates from surrounding counties on charges of public disturbance or vagrancy. Thomas Caldwell was among this group, a 34-year-old carpenter from Wolfe County whose only crime had been defending his sister's honor against a traveling salesman's unwanted advances. The magistrate in Campton had declared Thomas's violent outburst evidence of dangerous instability and ordered his immediate commitment. Thomas's wife, Sarah, had pleaded desperately as the asylum wagon carried her husband away, promising to pay any fine or restitution necessary for his release. The new arrivals were processed in the asylum's receiving room, a stark chamber illuminated by gas lamps that cast dancing shadows on whitewashed walls. Hannah Rutledge moved among them with clinical efficiency, recording names, ages, and supposed symptoms in a thick ledger. Her assistants stripped each man of his personal belongings and clothing, issuing rough gray uniforms that marked them as patients of the state. Dr. Crampton observed the proceedings from behind a desk cluttered with medical instruments and glass vials containing various colored liquids. He studied each new arrival with the detached interest of a natural scientist examining specimens, occasionally making notations in his ever-present leather journal. When his gaze fell upon Thomas Caldwell, he paused, pen hovering over the page. "Strong constitution," Crampton murmured to Rutledge. "Good muscle tone, clear eyes. This one shows promise for the advanced trials." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night air. The doctor's words carried implications he couldn't fully grasp, but the cold satisfaction in those gray eyes suggested something far removed from healing or mercy. Around him, his fellow prisoners, for that's what they truly were regardless of medical terminology, shuffled nervously as they were assigned to various wards throughout the asylum. The treatment began immediately. Patients selected for Crampton's special attention were escorted to a wing of the asylum that had been sealed off from the general population, its windows painted black from the inside to prevent observation. Here, in a series of rooms that resembled a medieval torture chamber more than a medical facility, the true nature of Crampton's research revealed itself. The first experiments focused on what Crampton termed cerebral stimulation, the injection of various chemical compounds directly into patients' bloodstreams while they were restrained on iron tables. The substances had been supplied by Pemberton Pharmaceuticals of Boston. a company eager to test new formulations without the oversight that traditional medical trials required. Some compounds produced violent convulsions that could be heard throughout the sealed wing. Others induced a catatonic state so profound that patients appeared to be dead, their breathing barely detectable even to trained observers. Thomas Caldwell endured his first injection on October 16th, a yellowish liquid that burned through his veins like liquid fire. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds as his nervous system rebelled against the foreign substance. He found himself screaming words in languages he didn't recognize, his body contorting in ways that seemed to defy human anatomy. Through the haze of chemical-induced delirium, he glimpsed Dr. Crampton taking careful notes, timing the duration of each symptom with a pocket watch. The treatments continued nightly, each more elaborate than the last. Crampton had developed what he called a graduated exposure protocol, testing increasingly dangerous compounds on the same subjects to document their cumulative effects. Men who survived the initial trials were subjected to combinations of drugs that produced symptoms ranging from temporary blindness to complete paralysis. Those who died, and many did, were quickly removed to make room for fresh subjects arriving daily from across Kentucky. Hannah Rutledge proved invaluable in these endeavors, her nursing training allowing her to keep patients alive long enough for Crampton to complete his observations. She had developed techniques for reviving subjects who had gone into cardiac arrest, using primitive electrical devices to restart their hearts. Her dedication to the work went beyond professional duty. She seemed to derive genuine satisfaction from the power she wielded over human life and death. But the experiments demanded more than just test subjects. They required absolute secrecy. When families began making inquiries about their missing relatives, Rutledge implemented what she called containment protocols. Visitors to the asylum were given fabricated death certificates and directed to a small cemetery on the grounds where empty graves bore the names of men who were still alive in the experimental wing. Those who pressed too hard for answers sometimes found themselves facing their own commitment proceedings. Declared mentally unstable by Dr. Crampton after brief examinations that focused more on their knowledge of asylum operations than their actual mental state. The system worked with terrifying efficiency through the winter of 1886 and into the spring of 1887. By summer, more than 200 men had disappeared into the asylum's experimental wing, their existence erased from official records as thoroughly as if they had never been born. Yet Crampton's ambitions continued to grow, and with them, the risks that would ultimately lead to his downfall. As spring turned to summer in 1887, the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum had transformed into something far more sinister than its original humanitarian mission. Dr. Crampton's experimental wing had expanded to occupy nearly half of the facility's space, with new sections being added monthly to accommodate the ever-growing number of test subjects. The legitimate patients, those genuinely suffering from mental illness, found themselves increasingly isolated in cramped quarters, while Crampton's research consumed more resources and personnel. The doctor's leather journal had grown into a collection of 7 volumes, each filled with meticulous observations of human suffering, documented with scientific precision. His handwriting had evolved over the months, becoming more erratic as the experiments intensified. Pages were filled with sketches of facial expressions during various stages of chemical poisoning, detailed timelines of neurological breakdown, and calculations determining the minimum dosage required to produce specific symptoms without causing immediate death. Hannah Rutledge had recruited additional staff for the experimental wing, carefully selecting individuals whose backgrounds suggested they would ask few questions about their duties. Many were former Confederate soldiers struggling to find work in the post-war economy, men whose wartime experiences had already numbed them to violence and death. Others were recent immigrants from Ireland and Germany who spoke little English and depended entirely on the asylum for their livelihood. Among these new recruits was Wilhelm Brennan, a German immigrant who had arrived in Kentucky just 6 months earlier, seeking work in the coal mines. When mining opportunities failed to materialize, he had accepted Rutledge's offer of employment at the asylum, grateful for steady wages that allowed him to send money back to his family in Bavaria. Wilhelm's job involved maintaining the experimental equipment and disposing of materials that Crampton deemed no longer useful, a euphemism that covered everything from soiled clothing to human remains. The disposal process had become increasingly elaborate as the body count mounted. Initially, Crampton had relied on the asylum's official cemetery, falsifying records to account for the unusually high mortality rate. But as the numbers grew impossible to explain through natural causes, more creative solutions became necessary. Wilhelm discovered that the limestone caves honeycombing the area around Frankfurt provided perfect locations for concealing evidence of the experiments. Bodies could be lowered into deep crevices where they would never be found, or dissolved in the acidic pools that formed in the lower chambers. But Crampton's most ambitious project involved partnership with medical schools throughout the Northeast, institutions that paid handsomely for fresh cadavers used in anatomical instruction. The asylum's location in Kentucky provided perfect cover for this macabre trade. Bodies could be preserved in ice during winter months and shipped north in sealed coffins labeled as belonging to deceased mental patients. No one questioned the high mortality rate at an institution supposedly treating the most disturbed minds in the Commonwealth. The financial arrangements were handled through a complex network of intermediaries that insulated both Crampton and his customers from legal liability. Dr. Marcus Wainwright at Harvard Medical School served as the primary contact, coordinating shipments and payments through a series of shell companies established in various states. The profits were enormous. A single preserved corpse could bring as much as $200, more than most Kentucky farmers earned in an entire year. Thomas Caldwell had survived longer than most subjects in the experimental wing, his strong constitution allowing him to endure treatments that killed weaker men within days. By July of 1887, he had become one of Crampton's most valuable test subjects, his body's resilience providing opportunities to explore the long-term effects of repeated chemical exposure. But survival came at a terrible cost. Thomas's mind had begun fracturing under the strain of constant torture, and he found himself slipping in and out of lucidity as the experiments continued. During his moments of clarity, Thomas observed the systematic nature of Crampton's operation. New subjects arrived regularly, processed through the receiving room, before disappearing into the experimental wing. He learned to recognize the sounds that indicated which treatments were being administered, the screams that accompanied injection protocols, the sudden silence that meant another subject had died, and the mechanical noises of Wilhelm's disposal activities in the hours before dawn. But Thomas wasn't the only one paying attention. In the counties surrounding Frankfurt, families had begun comparing notes about their missing relatives. Sarah Caldwell had organized meetings in Wolfe County, bringing together wives and mothers whose husbands and sons had vanished after encounters with asylum representatives. Similar groups were forming in Breathitt, Leslie, and Cumberland counties, all sharing stories that followed disturbingly similar patterns. The families had attempted to work through official channels, petitioning the governor's office and contacting state legislators. But their inquiries were met with form letters expressing sympathy for their loss, while explaining that mental illness often progressed rapidly in institutional settings. Death certificates were provided when requested, all bearing Dr. Crampton's signature and listing causes of death, ranging from apoplexy to consumption to general debility. More disturbing were the reports from families who had attempted to visit the asylum grounds. Several mothers described being turned away at the gate by armed guards who claimed their sons had become too violent to receive visitors. Others were permitted brief meetings with patients they were told were their relatives, only to realize that the heavily medicated men they encountered were complete strangers. When they protested, they were informed that mental illness had so thoroughly altered their loved one's appearance that recognition was impossible. By late summer of 1887, the network of grieving families had grown into an informal investigation that threatened to expose Crampton's operation. Sarah Caldwell had made contact with newspaper editors in Lexington and Louisville, sharing documentation that suggested systematic irregularities in asylum records. The Courier-Journal had assigned a reporter to investigate the unusually high death rate at the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum, and preliminary inquiries were raising questions that Crampton couldn't easily answer. The doctor realized that his carefully constructed system was approaching its limits. Too many people were asking too many questions, and the political protection he had enjoyed through Governor Knott's administration might not survive closer scrutiny. Something had to be done to eliminate the sources of these troublesome inquiries, and Hannah Rutledge had already begun developing solutions that would soon claim victims far beyond the asylum's walls. The autumn of 1887 brought an unseasonable chill to central Kentucky, as if nature itself recoiled from the horrors unfolding within the asylum's walls. Dr. Crampton's experiments had evolved into something approaching industrial-scale human testing, with new subjects arriving daily from across the Commonwealth. The leather journals documenting his research now filled an entire cabinet in his private office, their pages chronicling 18 months of systematic torture disguised as medical science. But the most disturbing development was the expansion of Crampton's influence beyond the asylum grounds. Working through a network of corrupt magistrates and local officials, he had effectively created a pipeline for acquiring test subjects from Kentucky's most vulnerable populations. Men could be declared insane for infractions as minor as public drunkenness or failure to pay debts, their commitments rubber-stamped by judges who received regular payments from the asylum's discretionary fund. The process had become so streamlined that Hannah Rutledge maintained a standing order for 20 new subjects weekly, specifying particular physical characteristics that made individuals suitable for different experimental protocols. Strong young men were preferred for testing compounds that might prove useful to the military, while older subjects were reserved for toxicity trials that had lower survival rates. Women were generally avoided, as their disappearances attracted more attention from family members and community leaders. Wilhelm Brennan had become indispensable to the operation, his duties expanding far beyond simple maintenance work. He had developed expertise in preserving human organs for shipment to northern medical schools, and his mechanical skills proved valuable in constructing specialized equipment for Crampton's more elaborate experiments. The German immigrant had also taken on responsibility for what Rutledge euphemistically called external operations, activities that took place beyond the asylum's walls when containment required more aggressive measures. The first external operation occurred in September 1887, when Sarah Caldwell's investigation began attracting attention from state legislators. Her documentation of missing men from Wolfe County had reached the desk of State Senator Robert Fleming, who announced plans to visit the asylum for an unscheduled inspection. Fleming's inquiry posed an existential threat to Crampton's research. A thorough examination of asylum records would immediately reveal the discrepancies between official death certificates and the actual number of men who had entered the facility. Hannah Rutledge volunteered to handle the Fleming problem personally. On September 14th, the senator was found dead in his Frankfort hotel room, apparently having suffered a heart attack during the night. The local physician who examined the body noted nothing suspicious about Fleming's death, largely because he had been generously compensated by the asylum to avoid conducting a thorough examination. Fleming's planned inspection was quietly cancelled, and his investigation materials mysteriously disappeared from his hotel room before family members could retrieve them. But Sarah Caldwell proved more persistent than anticipated. Fleming's death had actually strengthened her resolve, convincing her that powerful forces were working to conceal the truth about her husband's disappearance. She had begun corresponding with families in other states who reported similar patterns of men vanishing after being declared insane by respected physicians. Her letters revealed that Kentucky was not unique. Similar operations were apparently active in Tennessee, West Virginia, and southern Ohio. The implications were staggering. If Crampton's research was part of a larger network of illegal human experimentation, the number of victims could reach into the thousands. Sarah's investigation had uncovered evidence of regular communications between the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum and institutions in other states, suggesting coordination that went far beyond a single doctor's criminal activities. Meanwhile, within the asylum's experimental wing, Thomas Caldwell had managed to maintain enough lucidity to begin documenting what he witnessed. Using charcoal scraps and torn pieces of fabric, he had created a primitive record of the experiments he had observed or endured. His makeshift journal, hidden beneath loose floorboards in his cell, contained sketches of the experimental equipment, descriptions of various chemical compounds, and most importantly, a list of names of men who had died under Crampton's care. Thomas had also discovered that he wasn't the only survivor attempting to preserve evidence of the experiments. A former teacher named Benjamin Curtis from Montgomery County had been conducting his own covert documentation, memorizing details that could be shared with the outside world if either man ever managed to escape. Between them, they had compiled information about more than 200 men who had entered the experimental wing over the past 18 months. The opportunity for escape came in October 1887, when a fire in the asylum's laundry building drew most of the staff away from the experimental wing. Thomas and Benjamin managed to slip out of their cells during the confusion, making their way toward the main building where they hoped to reach the outside world. But their freedom was short-lived. Wilhelm Brennan discovered their escape within minutes and alerted the guards who patrolled the asylum grounds. Rather than simply returning the men to their cells, Rutledge decided that their escape attempt demonstrated too much awareness of the asylum's true purpose. She ordered them transferred to what she called the terminal ward, a section of the experimental wing reserved for subjects who were no longer useful for ongoing research. Here, the most dangerous and painful experiments were conducted, typically resulting in death within hours or days. Benjamin Curtis died that same night, his body unable to withstand the massive doses of an experimental nerve agent that Crampton was testing for potential military applications. Thomas survived, but the experience left him partially paralyzed and struggling with severe neurological damage. Yet his mind remained clear enough to understand that his time was running short, and that soon he would join the hundreds of men whose bodies lay hidden in the limestone caves beneath Frankfurt. But outside the asylum walls, forces were gathering that would soon bring Crampton's reign of terror to an end. Sarah Caldwell had made contact with a federal investigator who specialized in medical fraud, and her documentation of the asylum's irregularities had reached officials in Washington who were beginning to take notice. The web of corruption that had protected Crampton's operation for so long was finally beginning to unravel, though the cost in human lives would prove staggering before justice could be served. The question that haunted everyone who would later investigate the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum was simple yet terrifying. If Crampton's experiments had been allowed to continue for 18 months, despite growing evidence of systematic murder, how many other institutions across America were conducting similar research under the guise of legitimate medical science? November 1887 brought the first hard frost to Frankfurt, coating the asylum grounds with a glittering layer of ice that seemed to preserve the horror within like insects trapped in amber. Dr. Crampton's behavior had become increasingly erratic as external pressures mounted, his meticulous scientific facade cracking to reveal something far more disturbing beneath. The leather journals that had once contained precise observations now rambled through pages of incoherent theories about human consciousness and the nature of suffering, punctuated by detailed sketches of dissected organs and facial expressions captured at the moment of death. Hannah Rutledge had assumed greater control over daily operations as Crampton descended into what could only be described as methodical madness. Her network of external agents had expanded to include corrupt officials in 6 counties, all working to maintain the steady flow of test subjects that fed the doctor's insatiable appetite for human experimentation. But the system was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as federal investigators began asking questions that couldn't be answered with forged documents and bribed witnesses. The breaking point came on November 8th, when Federal Marshal James Douglas arrived in Frankfurt with a warrant to inspect the asylum's records. Douglas had been investigating reports of irregularities in Kentucky's institutional system, prompted by Sarah Caldwell's persistent correspondence with officials in Washington. His authority superseded state jurisdiction, making him immune to the political protection that had shielded Crampton's operation for so long. Rutledge received word of Douglas's impending visit through her network of informants in the state government. She immediately implemented what she called the sterilization protocol, a plan she had developed for eliminating evidence in case of federal investigation. The protocol involved destroying all documentation of the experimental program and eliminating any witnesses who could provide testimony about illegal activities. Wilhelm Brennan worked through the night of November 7th, feeding thousands of pages of medical records into the asylum's furnaces. The leather journals documenting Crampton's experiments proved more difficult to destroy, their thick bindings requiring hours of careful burning to ensure complete destruction. By dawn, nearly 2 years of meticulous documentation had been reduced to ash, leaving only the physical evidence contained within the experimental wing itself. But the most disturbing aspect of the sterilization protocol involved the surviving test subjects. Rutledge had calculated that 43 men remained alive in the experimental wing, their continued existence representing an unacceptable risk to the operation's security. Rather than attempt to conceal them during Douglas's inspection, she made a decision that would haunt investigators for decades to come. Thomas Caldwell was among the 43 men marked for elimination. Despite the neurological damage from his recent torture, he understood what was happening when guards began moving subjects from the experimental wing to a previously unused section of the asylum's basement. The area had been converted into what resembled an execution chamber, with drain systems installed to facilitate the disposal of large quantities of blood and other bodily fluids. The killing began at midnight on November 8th, just hours before Marshal Douglas was scheduled to arrive. Rutledge personally administered lethal injections to each subject, using a concentrated form of morphine that induced cardiac arrest within minutes. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had planned this contingency for months, her movements precise and unhurried despite the enormous scope of the task before her. Thomas managed to delay his execution by feigning unconsciousness when guards came for him, allowing him to witness the systematic murder of men he had lived alongside for more than a year. He watched Benjamin Carter from Harlan County die with tears streaming down his face, still clutching a crude cross he had carved from a piece of wood. James Mullins from Pike County whispered his wife's name as the poison coursed through his veins, his body convulsing before falling still on the concrete floor. But Thomas's reprieve was temporary. As dawn approached and Rutledge neared completion of her grisly task, guards returned to collect the remaining subjects. Thomas found himself strapped to the same table where he had endured months of torture, looking up at Rutledge's cold blue eyes as she prepared the syringe that would end his life. The irony was not lost on him. After surviving experiments that had killed hundreds of other men, he would die not as a test subject, but as a witness whose testimony threatened the entire operation. Yet fate had one final twist in store. As Rutledge leaned over Thomas to administer the lethal injection, the asylum's main building erupted in chaos. Federal Marshal Douglas had arrived ahead of schedule, accompanied by a team of investigators who had surrounded the facility during the night. Guards throughout the asylum were scrambling to respond to the unexpected raid, leaving the basement execution chamber temporarily undefended. Thomas seized his opportunity, using strength he didn't know he still possessed, to break free from his restraints. The months of chemical torture had left his body damaged, but had also heightened his awareness of his own physical limits. He struck Rutledge with a piece of medical equipment, stunning her long enough to escape from the basement chamber and make his way toward the main building, where he hoped to find Marshal Douglas. What he discovered there would complete the picture of horror that had consumed the Eastern Kentucky lunatic asylum. The federal investigators had uncovered evidence that went far beyond illegal human experimentation. They had stumbled upon a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Kentucky's government and extended to similar institutions across multiple states. The systematic murder of indigent men was just one component of a larger operation that involved organ trafficking, pharmaceutical testing, and the development of chemical weapons for potential military use. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Hidden in Dr. Crampton's private safe, investigators found correspondence that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy and the identities of everyone involved in its operation. The letters painted a picture of systematic evil that had been disguised as medical progress, protected by political corruption, and funded by institutions that should have been dedicated to healing rather than harm. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Frankfurt intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when Thomas finally reaches the federal investigators and reveals the full truth about what occurred within those asylum walls. As Thomas stumbled through the asylum's corridors, blood streaming from wounds inflicted during his escape, he carried with him knowledge that would expose one of the most systematic campaigns of human experimentation in American history. But would anyone believe the testimony of a man officially declared insane? And would the evidence be sufficient to bring justice to those responsible for the deaths of more than 200 innocent victims? Federal Marshal James Douglas had seen many disturbing things during his 20-year career investigating institutional corruption, but nothing had prepared him for what he discovered in the basement of the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum. The execution chamber that Hannah Rutledge had constructed resembled something from the Spanish Inquisition rather than a medical facility. Its concrete floors stained with the blood of 42 men who had been systematically murdered in the hours before his arrival. Thomas Caldwell's sudden appearance in the main building, bleeding and barely coherent, but desperately trying to communicate what he had witnessed, provided the key testimony that Douglas needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Despite his neurological damage and obvious physical trauma, Thomas managed to lead investigators back to the experimental wing, where evidence of 18 months of systematic torture remained visible in every room. The specialized equipment that Wilhelm Brennan had constructed for Crampton's research told its own story of deliberate cruelty. Restraint tables fitted with electrical devices designed to maintain consciousness during painful procedures. Glass containers holding preserved organs in various stages of dissection. Chemical apparatus for creating compounds that had no legitimate medical purpose. Most disturbing of all, a collection of photographic plates documenting facial expressions during different stages of experimental torture, organized by subject number and type of treatment administered. Dr. Crampton himself was found in his private office, sitting calmly behind his desk, as if the chaos erupting throughout the asylum was merely an inconvenient interruption to his daily routine. His gray eyes showed no recognition of the gravity of his situation as Douglas placed him under arrest for murder, fraud, and conspiracy against the United States. When questioned about the men who had died under his care, Crampton responded only that their sacrifice had advanced human knowledge and would ultimately benefit society as a whole. "You cannot comprehend the magnitude of what we have accomplished here," Crampton told Douglas, his voice carrying the same clinical detachment he had used when describing experimental procedures. These subjects were contributing to research that will revolutionize medicine and provide invaluable intelligence for national defense. Their deaths were not murders, but necessary casualties in the advancement of science. Hannah Rutledge proved more difficult to apprehend. She had disappeared from the asylum grounds during the confusion of the federal raid, taking with her a substantial amount of cash and documents that investigators later determined contained contacts for similar operations in other states. Her network of corrupt officials and hired assassins had provided her with resources for escape that Crampton's scientific obsession had never contemplated needing. The search for Rutledge led Douglas's team to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy that had made Crampton's research possible. Governor James Proctor Nott's involvement became clear when investigators discovered a secret account containing more than $50,000 in payments from the asylum, money that had been used to finance his political campaigns and personal lifestyle. The governor's protection had been purchased not just with cash, but with promises of access to experimental results that could benefit Kentucky's emerging pharmaceutical industry. More disturbing was the discovery of Crampton's correspondence with institutions across the Northeast. Harvard Medical School had indeed been purchasing preserved corpses from the asylum, but the relationship went far deeper than simple cadaver trafficking. Dr. Marcus Wainwright had been coordinating a network of researchers conducting similar experiments on unwilling subjects, sharing results and techniques that maximized the scientific value extracted from each victim. The chemical compounds being tested at the asylum had been supplied by legitimate pharmaceutical companies who were aware they were being used on human subjects without consent. Pemberton Pharmaceuticals had provided detailed instructions for testing procedures, specifying dosages and observation protocols that could only have been developed through prior human experimentation. The corporate executives involved in these arrangements had insulated themselves through layers of intermediary companies, but their fingerprints were evident throughout the documentation Douglas's team recovered. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of correspondence with military officials who had expressed interest in Crampton's research into chemical weapons. The nerve agents being tested on asylum patients had been developed specifically for potential use against enemy forces, with the subjects serving as unwitting test pilots for weapons that could kill thousands in future conflicts. The intersection of medical research, corporate profits, and military applications had created a perfect storm of institutional evil that had consumed more than 200 lives. Wilhelm Brennan was found hiding in the limestone caves beneath the asylum, surrounded by evidence of his role in disposing of victims' remains. The German immigrant broke down completely when confronted with the magnitude of his participation in the murders, revealing details about the disposal process that helped investigators locate mass graves throughout the region. His testimony painted a picture of systematic body disposal that had been operating since the beginning of Crampton's tenure, with remains scattered across dozens of cave systems and abandoned mine shafts. The caves themselves told a story that exceeded even Douglas's worst fears. Hundreds of bodies in various states of decomposition filled crevices and underground chambers, many showing evidence of the experimental procedures that had killed them. Victims' personal effects, watches, wedding rings, family photographs, had been carefully collected and stored in waterproof containers, creating a macabre archive of lives destroyed in the name of scientific progress. But the most devastating discovery came when investigators found Crampton's master journal, hidden in a secret compartment behind his office fireplace. This final volume contained not just records of the experiments conducted at the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum, but correspondence with similar facilities across America. The network of institutional murder that Crampton had participated in was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, with operations active in at least 12 states and coordination provided by a shadow organization of physicians, pharmaceutical executives, and government officials. The journal revealed that the Kentucky operation was actually considered a model for expansion, with plans to establish similar facilities throughout the South, where political corruption and economic desperation would provide ideal conditions for large-scale human experimentation. The profits generated from organ trafficking and pharmaceutical testing would fund this expansion, creating a self-sustaining system of institutionalized murder disguised as medical research. Thomas Caldwell's testimony proved crucial in understanding how the conspiracy had operated and recruited its victims. His detailed knowledge of the experimental procedures and the personnel involved provided investigators with information that no amount of documentation could have supplied. Despite his neurological damage, Thomas possessed a remarkable memory for details that had sustained him through months of torture: names, dates, procedures, and most importantly, the locations where other victims might be found. His account of the systematic recruitment process revealed how Crampton and Rutledge had perfected their method of acquiring subjects. Corrupt magistrates in rural counties would identify men whose disappearances would attract minimal attention. Widowers, drifters, immigrants, and those estranged from their families. These individuals would be arrested on fabricated charges, declared mentally incompetent after cursory examinations, and transported to the asylum, where they would vanish into the experimental wing. The financial incentives that maintained this system were staggering in their scope. Each magistrate received $50 per commitment, more than most rural officials earned in a month of legitimate work. Sheriff's deputies who transported subjects to the asylum earned additional payments, while coroners who signed fraudulent death certificates received bonuses based on the number of documents they processed. The conspiracy had corrupted the entire legal system of eastern Kentucky, creating a machine designed specifically for the harvesting of human beings. The investigation that followed Thomas Caldwell's escape from the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum would become one of the most extensive federal criminal inquiries of the 19th century. Marshal Douglas's team spent 6 months documenting the evidence recovered from the facility, ultimately compiling more than 3,000 pages of testimony and physical evidence that detailed the systematic murder of at least 214 men. Dr. Silas Crampton was tried in federal court in Louisville during the summer of 1888, facing charges that included murder, conspiracy, mail fraud, and violations of the Federal Food and Drug Act. The prosecution presented evidence that painted him not as a misguided researcher but as a calculating killer who had used his medical credentials to disguise wholesale butchery. His defense attorneys argued that he had been conducting legitimate medical research authorized by state officials, but this strategy collapsed when Governor Knott's involvement in the conspiracy became public knowledge. The trial lasted 7 weeks and attracted national attention as details of the experiments emerged in court testimony. Thomas Caldwell served as the primary witness for the prosecution, his detailed account of the torture he had endured, providing a human face to the statistical evidence of systematic murder. Despite efforts by defense attorneys to portray him as mentally unstable, Thomas's testimony remained consistent and credible throughout days of cross-examination. Crampton showed no emotion as witness after witness described the horrors that had occurred under his direction. When finally given an opportunity to address the court before sentencing, he remained unrepentant, insisting that his research had advanced human knowledge and would ultimately save more lives than it had cost. "History will vindicate my methods," he told Judge Robert Boyd. "The men who died here died in service to a greater cause than their individual existence could ever have achieved." Judge Boyd sentenced Crampton to death by hanging, a punishment that reflected the court's conclusion that his crimes represented some of the most heinous acts ever committed on American soil. The sentence was carried out on December 15, 1888, in the courtyard of the Louisville Federal Prison, with Thomas Caldwell among the witnesses who watched Crampton pay the ultimate price for his crimes. Hannah Rutledge was never captured, despite a nationwide manhunt that continued for more than a decade. Investigators traced her movements through several states, following reports of suspicious deaths at various medical institutions that matched the patterns established in Kentucky. Her network of contacts and financial resources apparently provided her with opportunities to continue her work under different identities, though the scale of her operations was necessarily reduced by the attention that the Kentucky investigation had attracted. Wilhelm Brennan cooperated fully with investigators and received a sentence of 20 years in federal prison in exchange for his testimony about the disposal of victims' remains. His detailed knowledge of the cave systems around Frankfort proved invaluable in recovering bodies and providing closure to families who had spent months wondering about the fate of their missing relatives. He was released after serving 14 years and deported to Germany, where he lived quietly until his death in 1919. The political fallout from the scandal destroyed several careers and led to significant reforms in Kentucky's institutional oversight systems. Governor Knott was forced to resign in disgrace, his political career ending amid revelations of the massive bribes he had accepted from the asylum. Several state legislators who had received payments from Crampton's network were defeated in subsequent elections, while others faced criminal charges for their roles in facilitating the conspiracy. The pharmaceutical companies that had supplied experimental compounds faced congressional investigations, but ultimately escaped serious consequences through legal maneuvering and political influence. Pemberton Pharmaceuticals eventually settled civil lawsuits filed by victims' families for undisclosed amounts, while other companies involved in the conspiracy simply dissolved their operations and reformed under different names. Harvard Medical School conducted an internal investigation of Dr. Marcus Wainwright's activities, but concluded that he had acted independently without institutional knowledge or approval. Wainwright himself resigned his position and disappeared from public view, though investigators suspected he continued his research through private channels. The broader network of medical institutions involved in purchasing organs and cadavers from the Kentucky operation was never fully exposed, as many records had been destroyed before federal investigators could access them. Thomas Caldwell survived his ordeal, but never fully recovered from the neurological damage inflicted during his months of torture. He returned to Wolfe County, where his wife Sarah cared for him until his death in 1904. Sarah became a prominent advocate for institutional reform, traveling throughout Kentucky to speak about her husband's experiences and working to establish oversight systems that would prevent similar atrocities in the future. The Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum was permanently closed following the investigation. Its buildings eventually demolished to remove any trace of the horrors that had occurred within their walls. The state constructed a new mental health facility in Lexington, with strict oversight procedures designed to prevent the types of abuses that had flourished under Crampton's administration. Yet questions remained that were never fully answered. The scope of the conspiracy suggested coordination between institutions across multiple states, implying that similar operations might have been active in other locations. Federal investigators received reports of suspicious activities at facilities in Tennessee, West Virginia, and southern Ohio, but lack of resources and political opposition prevented comprehensive investigations of these allegations. The limestone caves that had served as mass graves were sealed by state authorities, officially to prevent further contamination, but also to discourage curiosity seekers who might disturb the remains of victims whose bodies were never recovered. Local residents reported strange sounds emanating from the sealed caves for years afterward, though these were likely explained by natural geological processes rather than anything supernatural. The true number of victims claimed by Crampton's research will probably never be known with certainty. While investigators documented the deaths of 214 men, evidence suggested that the operation had been active for longer than initially suspected and may have included victims whose disappearances were never reported to authorities. The network of caves beneath Frankfort likely contains remains that will never be discovered. Silent testimony to one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that the institutional failures that enabled Crampton's crimes were not unique to Kentucky or to the 1880s. The combination of political corruption, economic incentives, and scientific ambition that had created the conditions for systematic murder continued to exist throughout the country, raising questions about what other atrocities might be occurring under the guise of legitimate medical research. The legacy of the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum serves as a reminder that the pursuit of scientific knowledge, when divorced from moral constraints and proper oversight, can become indistinguishable from systematic evil. The men who died in Crampton's experiments were not volunteers for the advancement of human knowledge. They were victims of a conspiracy that valued their lives less than the data their deaths could provide. Thomas Caldwell's courage in exposing this conspiracy, despite the personal cost of his testimony, ensured that their deaths would not be completely meaningless. His willingness to relive his trauma in court proceedings helped establish legal precedents that strengthened protections for patients in medical institutions throughout the United States. Yet the question remains whether these protections are sufficient to prevent future atrocities, or whether the fundamental conditions that enabled Crampton's crimes continue to exist in different forms. This mystery shows us how easily institutional authority can be corrupted when oversight fails, and powerful interests align against the vulnerable members of society. The systematic nature of the crimes committed at the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum demonstrates that evil often wears the mask of progress, using the language of science and medicine to disguise its true intentions. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that similar operations could exist today under different circumstances? The parallels between Crampton's conspiracy and modern concerns about pharmaceutical testing and institutional oversight are disturbing to consider. Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how society can prevent such atrocities from occurring again. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries from America's past. See you in the next video.